Heyo friends. Okay, here is the promised video about organization of a processed essay. And this applies also to organization of basically any essay that we're going to write in AP Lit. The objectives are for you to learn how to organize and to outline an essay, to quote evidence, and to cite evidence. Some of this is going to be new, some of this is going to be review, so we're just going to talk through it point by point. What you should do while I'm talking through it point by point is listen, obviously, take some notes. I will give you a quick little quiz when we get to class to verify that you've listened and paid attention, and then document questions for the next time we meet. The key points of this endeavor, we're going to initiate some changes in the way that typically essays are written or have historically been written by you in your high school English career. The key points that I want to hit really hard here are, first, we're going to organize our essays by idea. We're going to organize them chronologically. Doesn't make much sense to talk about what happened at the end of the essay first. What happened at the end of the passage first. Typically, that's not the way we want to do it. And we want to organize by shift. We've talked about this both in our reading of prose and of poetry. It's just really handy to find the shift, and then you can very easily talk about what happens at the beginning and then what changed, because change is always compelling, as we know from life. What we are not going to do is organize by device. Yeah, I know we taught you that in 9th grade, and you probably had some of it in 10th grade too. I'm not sure about that, but we are not going to organize by device. So for instance, your first paragraph is not going to be about, hey, look, these are all the metaphors I found. And then you're going to write a second paragraph that has all the symbols that you found. And then you're going to write a third paragraph that has all the whatever else that you found. We are not going to organize by device. The other thing that I want to point out is that you need to play to your strengths, not to my strengths, to your own strengths. This means that you're going to emphasize the things when you write that you found compelling when you read the passage. Other people may find different things. That's perfectly fine. That's what makes these passages interesting. There are lots of things to find. And then the other thing, this is a super key point that you need to keep in mind and never, ever, ever forget. You need to capture the entire passage, including the last line. Typically, these passages that they give you on a lit exam are extracted from a whole entire novel, and you may not have all the context. As we talked about yesterday in class, they'll give you some context sometimes in the prompt, but they had to choose where to begin and end the passage, which means that that last line is a deliberate choice. And when you're reading the passage and when you're thinking about what to write, you need to consider why that last line is there. Okay, so my outline is going to look like this. I know going in that I am going to have 4 complete paragraphs. The first paragraph is going to be my introduction. You know this format, right? I'm going to have an introduction that has a thesis and a theme statement. I did put a sample thesis with a theme statement on Edmodo for you to look at because that thesis format is kind of a departure from what you're used to also. Anyway, in my introduction, I'm going to argue that Mariam is characterized as naive and hopeful at first, but she ultimately becomes disappointed once she gains knowledge of the situation. So you have probably already written a thesis or thought about what your thesis is going to be. If it differs from mine, fine. That's perfectly okay. Just because my thesis is to argue that she starts as naive and hopeful and then becomes disappointed and enlightened doesn't mean you need to argue the same thing. So I'm not telling you that your thesis is wrong. I'm just saying this is what I'm going to argue. So that's going to be my thesis. My second paragraph, so my first body paragraph, is going to be about Mariam before the shift. She is naive and hopeful. I'm going to talk about her flat reflection versus Jalil's tall walls and cypress trees. In those things, there's juxtaposition, symbolism, metaphor. I'm going to talk about the deep-seated glow of her hopes. Here, I'm going to analyze diction. I'm going to evaluate the use of the word glow because it suggests that the hope emanates from her. which also suggests further that the glow or the light will eventually die out. And we know it does because we read this passage yesterday and it doesn't go very well for her. I'm also going to look in this paragraph at Mariam's simple sentences. We talked a little bit about syntax and the importance of syntax. Here's an example for you. Mariam's simple sentences represent her childlike outlook and her lack of power. Also, further to that, I'm going to look at her silences, and this may be something that is sort of new for you, to evaluate what is not there. But she doesn't say anything at certain points when she's spoken to. So the driver speaks to her and she looks at him in response, or she crosses her arms. This to me indicates, again, a lack of power, and she's childlike. You're talking to me, but I'm not going to talk to you. And she is stubborn in her hope that Jaleel will come. And then I'm going to talk about the natural elements of the neighborhood. Just like Miriam is certain that events that are listed in that portion of the passage will happen. There will be a moon, she'll hear crickets, she'll hear dogs barking. She's positive that those things will happen, and she is just as certain that Jaleel will come to her. Or at least she tries to convince herself that she's just as certain. In the third paragraph, we're going to envision the shift in the passage right here. And then in the third paragraph, I'm going to talk about Mariam after the shift, where she is enlightened and disappointed. This is the moment at which Mariam becomes more active. The driver fumbles. She sheds him, almost like she's shedding an old skin. You know how some animals shed a skin, and that's like a marker of advancement for them? And she bursts through the door. She becomes much more active. Her eyes scan the garden. We talked briefly yesterday about how that garden seems to be an allusion to the Garden of Eden, and we all know what happened there. Adam and Eve got knowledge, and everything fell apart after that. She recognizes what's occurring, and she rejects what's happening by kicking and refusing to move. And then these pebbles make a reappearance, and they spill from her pocket. This is a metaphor. You could call it a symbol if you want to, but these pebbles represent the family that she was hoping would accept and love her. And when they spill from her pocket, she has no more hope, and she is disappointed. So let's look at, remember I talked about the need to capture the last line, capture the whole passage. So I've gone through the passage and I've highlighted all of the evidence that I'm going to use and talk about. You may have other evidence to prove a different argument, or other evidence to prove the same argument, and that's perfectly fine too. So I've gone through the passage and I've highlighted all the evidence that I'm going to use. And I want you to pay attention to how it is evenly distributed throughout the passage. This is going to tell any reader of the essay that I'm writing that I've paid attention to the whole thing and I've considered all of the development throughout the passage. So if I were to say, take this whole chunk out, and I'm just not going to address anything from there, that would be a real problem, because it would reveal to my reader that I've not paid attention to the entire passage. So I just wanted to show you visually what it looks like to ensure that you're covering all of what you need to cover. So there we go. That's what my outline's going to look like, and I want you to think in your planning about the argument that you're going to make and the evidence from before the shift and the evidence from after the shift. And then I'm going to close, as we always do, with a conclusion, and I'm going to take the time to come up with a really compelling theme statement so that I have a powerful closing. The next thing I want to talk about is and this should be pretty much a refresher. I know that some of you, I had this conversation with some of you when you were in 9th grade. I'm sure that others of you had it with the former Miss Ann and the current Miss Beatty. This is just a refresher. We want to quote bullets, not bombs. You need to think of the text you're pulling as very short bullet points. You need to use the words that sing, okay? We don't want to quote boring words. The words that we quote should be the ones where the author captured something in this word or this phrase that we can't capture ourselves in better, more compelling language. What I mean by that is you want to shoot for the beating heart moments. What are the phrases that you read that made you stop short a little bit and think, wow, this really tells me something important about this character? Then you want to introduce the quote and you want to mix it in with your own words. Here's an example. This would be a good way to cite evidence, or to quote evidence. Hosseini describes Mariam's hope emanating from her body in a soft, deep-seated glow as she approaches Jalil's house. I've taken the words here that are the most magical out of the passage, out of that sentence, and I've incorporated them into my own sentence. I want you to notice when you look at this sentence that if I took these quotation marks out, the sentence would flow just as well. Obviously, I have to leave the quotation marks there because I didn't write those words originally, but if I were to take them out, this sentence would flow just as nicely. This is a bad way to quote the same language. I could say, Hosseini says, for a moment, Mariam heard Nana's voice in her head, mocking, dousing the deep-seated glow of her hopes. Not only have I dropped a gigantic evidence bomb in there, but I've also sort of hidden the thing that I want to focus on. I've got all this other extra stuff in here, which I could definitely talk about if I was writing a different essay, but I really want to talk about the deep-seated glow of her hopes, so I don't need to say all this other stuff. And then even worse is to take that exact same sentence and just plop it in there with no introduction at all. I mean, this is barely an introduction, but at least it's something. So good, bad, terrible, awful. Please don't ever do either of these things. And then the last thing that I want to address with you is the need for citation. Like we said, we didn't write the words that we're quoting, so we need to give credit to the person who did. This citation is absolutely necessary for processed essays like the one that you've just been assigned or you will be assigned on Monday. When you're typing it at home, you need to cite appropriately the evidence that you're using. It is not necessary for you to do this during a timed essay. You've got 40 minutes to write this thing. Hustle. You need to be on the move. Don't waste your time writing the author's name and page numbers over and over again. It's not necessary for the timed essays that we do in class or that you will do on the exam. So it's real simple. You just need the last name of the author and the page number. So for instance, Hosseini 32. There's no commas, there's nothing weird in there, and here's how you drop it into a sentence. Here I've got this sentence where I've quoted deep-seated glow. That appears on page 32. So at the end of the sentence, but before the period, I'm going to put in parentheses Hosseini 32. If I have another quote that comes, and I need to do this for every single quote, if I have another quote that I'm including, I've already said the author's name here, so on the second one, I can just put the page number. Alternatively, if in my sentence I include the author's name, notice up here I just said the author, down here I said Hosseini describes, I've already said his name, so my parenthetical citation at the end of the sentence just needs to include the page number. If you have any questions about this or this is unclear in any way, you can watch the video again. You can take other notes. You can Google MLA formatting. MLA formatting, citations, and this resource, the OWL, the OWL at Purdue, is a super useful resource for you to use. So there you have it. That is how to organize an essay, that is how to quote, and that is how to properly cite the things that you have quoted. I will see you on Monday.